Hola, I'm Ed Cabrera. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County, I salute your commitment to being informed and engaged voters. Our group of volunteers that make up our Pros and Cons Committee aim to help you in your study of the propositions of the California 2024 General Election Ballot with this comprehensive video that discusses all 10 propositions. The League offers a number of tools for you to make informed choices. Our first volunteer, Tony Hyman, will start us on our way with 9 tips on how to evaluate ballot propositions.
The League of Women Voters knows that it's tough for you to evaluate the ballot. What do these propositions mean? Well, here's how you do it. 1, examine what the measure wants to accomplish. Do you agree with those goals? 2, is the measure consistent with your ideas about government? Do you think the proposed change will make things better? 3, what are the real sponsors and opponents of this measure? Check where the money is coming from. On the Voters Edge California website, it's Voters Edge. That's 2 words run together, votersedge.org. Great source of information. Number 4, is this measure written well? A lot of them aren't. Will it create conflicts in the law that may require court resolution or interpretation? Is it good government, or will it cause more problems than it will resolve? 5, does the measure create its own revenue source? Does it earmark, restrict, or obligate government money? If so, weigh the benefits of securing funding for the measure against the cost of reducing the flexibility of the budget. Number 6, does the measure mandate a government program or service without addressing how is it going to be funded? Number 7, does the measure deal with one issue that can be easily decided by a yes or no vote? Or is it a complex issue that should be thoroughly examined by the legislature? Number 8, if the measure amends the Constitution, consider whether it really belongs in the Constitution. Would a state law accomplish the same purpose? All constitutional amendments require voter approval. What we put in the Constitution would have to come back to the ballot to be changed. And last, be wary of distortion tactics and TV commercials that rely on image but tell you nothing of substance about the measure. Beware of half-truth.
Let us introduce the separate components that will be discussed in our presentation in an unbiased and non-partisan manner. First, we shall pose the question that the California taxpayer will be addressing with these propositions. The situation or present circumstance will then be discussed. Then we will address the proposed answer or solution to the question that was initially asked. The cost to the California taxpayer, shared by the Legislative Analyst Office in Sacramento, will then be framed. Finally, we will contrast the pros and cons of each proposition by spotlighting the key arguments, identifying some prominent parties in disagreement, and reporting the contribution totals regarding each measure. Please note that these totals come to us from the Office of the California Secretary of State and reflect totals reported as of the end of August 2024. Here you see the 10 propositions on the 2024 fall ballot. It is interesting to note that the propositions in the top row identified by single-digit numbers originated in the legislature. The measures identified by double digits in the bottom row began their lives as initiatives brought forth by the citizen petition process. We know that you may only be interested in studying individual propositions if you prioritize them or you think they might require extra time. As a result, we are providing you with the approximate times to arrive at the specific proposition you may wish to study. For example, I may want to focus on Proposition 34. So I would fast forward to the 4709 mark. So let us begin with the first proposition.
Hello, I'm Diane Matthews, and I'm going to speak to you about Proposition 2, which is a legislative statute that authorizes bonds for public schools and community college facilities. The question is, should California sell $10 billion worth of bonds to help school districts and community college districts build and modernize their public educational facilities? The situation is, California has 10,000 K-12 public schools and 115 community colleges. Money for building and renovating schools is raised by a combination of local and state bonds that are repaid with interest over time. The assessed value of the properties in a district impacts the amount of money the district can raise through local bonds. State bonds currently cover 50% of new construction and 60% of renovation costs, with districts providing the remainder through local bonds. Districts that are unable to raise $5 million through local bond measures can apply for additional funding. Almost all of the funds currently allocated for schools have already been awarded. Proposition 2 would allow the state to sell a $10 billion bond for constructing, renovating, or improving public school and community college facilities. Of the $10 billion raised, $8.5 billion will be awarded to school districts K-12 for renovation projects, new construction, career technical educational facilities, and/or for charter school facilities. Some funds will be set aside for small districts. $1.5 billion will be awarded to community college districts to support statewide project priorities. These monies will be awarded based on review by the legislature and the government. A portion of the K-12 money, $115 million, will be set aside for special projects. These include reducing lead levels in water on school sites, building and renovating classrooms to house transitional kindergarten programs, as all 4-year-olds will be eligible for TK starting in the 2025 to 2026 school year, and also for special facilities like gymnasiums, multipurpose rooms, libraries, or school kitchens. If Proposition 2 passes, California will borrow $10 billion to fund construction and modernization of our public education facilities. The repayment costs would run $500 million yearly for 35 years. The annual cost would be approximately 0.25% of the annual general fund revenues. The state looked at data on the impact of the learning environment on a variety of measures of student performance. Students attending classrooms with adequate lighting, comfortable seating, and clean, safe facilities demonstrated higher academic achievement as measured by standardized test scores in English language arts and in math. In contrast, classroom noise, substandard buildings, high temperatures in classrooms led to poorer outcomes for students, more absences and truancies, lower scores on standardized tests, increased behavior problems, and increased number of suspensions from school. Prop 2 would increase state funding for smaller and needier districts by allowing the districts who are unable to raise $15 million in local bonds, up from the current level of $5 million, to apply for funds, and by increasing the state's funding levels to 55% and 65% of construction and or renovation costs. In addition, Prop 2 would allow California to support community colleges as they address state-identified priorities. It's somewhat of a misnomer in that there is no organized opposition to this measure. Supporters, however, have voiced concern that Prop 2 is a good start, but it doesn't go far enough. It is still easier for districts in wealthier areas to raise matching funds through local bonds. Rural districts and those with lower income families will continue to have a hard time securing the money to fix school buildings. Support for Proposition 2 comes from the California Federation of Teachers and the California Labor Federation unions. It also is coming from Association of California School Administrators, California Business Alliance, California Chamber of Commerce, and the Community College League of California. There is no organized opposition to Proposition 2. The supporters of Proposition 2 have raised $1,785,000. There's no money reported to have been raised by the opponents, as none have come forward so far.
Hello, my name is Maureen Cormier, and I am here today to tell you about Proposition 3. This is a legislative constitutional amendment concerning the constitutional right to marriage. The question is what voters in the state of California are contemplating with Proposition 3, whether the Constitution should be updated to allow same-sex couples to legally marry. So here's the situation. In 2004, the mayor of San Francisco, Gavin Newsom, was issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples despite that it was contrary to federal law. The Supreme Court shut this practice down in a ruling. In addition, California voters voted to ban same-sex marriage in 2008. California's constitution has remained unchanged even in the face of a later Supreme Court ruling that made same-sex marriage legal in California. In 2015, the court legalized same-sex marriage across the country. So, now our legislators in Sacramento have introduced this amendment to proactively codify this protection in the wake of recent rulings by the Supreme Court that have overturned federal abortion protections. So now we get to the proposal. This proposition would add permanent language to the Constitution that would guarantee the right to same-sex marriage. This would also overturn a previous proposition passed in 2008 that had specifically defined marriage as a union only between a man and a woman. So the supporters say, those in favor of this proposition say that this is only updating the language in the Constitution to reflect a right already protected by ruling of the Supreme Court. Supporters further say that, in light of recent threats to our basic rights, such as the overturning of Roe v. Wade, it is especially timely to pass such a protection. Opponents say the measure goes too far. It would override marriage laws and remove protections against child marriages, incest, and polygamy. They argue that it's best for children to be raised by both mothers and fathers, and that the measure threatens our shared values of healthy families, healthy children, and a healthy society. There are a number of supporters of Proposition 3. Among them are Equality California, American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California, Planned Parenthood Affiliates of California, California Democratic Party, and Governor Gavin Newsom. So meanwhile, on the opposition of Proposition 3, we have the California Family Council and the American Council of Evangelicals. So here's what we're all curious about, the fiscal impact. This has no change in revenues or costs for state and local governments. Finally, a proposition that is not going to cost you any money. California Secretary of State has reported the money raised for Proposition 3. The supporters have raised over $2 million, and the opponents have not recorded contributions.
Hello, my name is Marilee Hyman. I'm going to share our information on Proposition 4 on the general election ballot. Proposition 4 is a bond measure put on the ballot by the legislature, which would raise $10 billion to provide safe drinking water, help with wildfire protection, and protect California communities and lands from the risks of climate change. Will California voters give the state permission to sell bonds to finance protections for safe drinking waters, wildfire prevention and recovery, flood control, and other environmental protection projects? Californians are presented with the reality that forest fires, prolonged droughts, and constant flooding are becoming commonplace. In addition, the state's vast agricultural industry, water quality, and wildlife is being affected by climate change. It has also been reported that too many Californians do not have safe drinking water. And this all comes at a time when budget cuts have reduced monies for programs aimed at reducing pollution. Passage of Prop 4 would result in the selling of $10 billion in bonds. The money raised would pay for reducing the risk of fire and restoring the damage from the fires. The funds would also help to restore and defend wetlands and wildlife populations. It would also make sure that drinking water would be safe. The money raised would be dispersed to a number of different entities such as local and state governments, native tribes, and non-profit groups and businesses. 40% of the funding must go to activities that will help lower-income communities or communities hit the hardest by environmental changes and disasters. If Proposition 4 passes, the state will incur increased costs of about $400 million annually for 40 years to repay the bond. Payment would come from the state general fund, and this would be about 0.5% of the state's general fund budget. In some cases, the additional state funding could replace local government money that would otherwise be needed for local projects. It could also reduce state and local costs for responding to and recovering from natural disasters. California faces growing threats from wildfires, water pollution, extreme heat, and other disasters. The right investments now could help prevent future damage and costs. Supporters are vocal in saying that it's best to be proactive and that spending money now would prevent increased costs in the future because the threats from wildfire, water pollution, extreme heat, and natural disasters are only growing. Opponents, on the other hand, say that while the cause is an important one, and we can use our state budget to accomplish these goals of preparing for the disasters and fighting pollution, they warn that taxpayers would be stuck with a bond that would double the costs in the future to $19 billion. They add that we would be spending money on technology that has not yet been proven. They further warn that we do not have safeguards on the spending, and we have little way of knowing if this money will be well spent. Supporters are Jennifer Clary, State Director of Clean Water Action, Tim Edwards, President of CAL FIRE Firefighters, and the Executive Director, California Regional of National Wildlife Federation, Beth Pratt. Opponents to Prop 4 are John Kupel, president of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, State Minority Leader Brian Jones, and Assemblyman Jim Patterson. Supporters have raised $170,000 for Prop 4. There is no reported monies from organized opponents.
Yes. Hello, I'm Joe Gustally, and I'm going to be talking about Proposition 5. Prop 5 allows local bonds for affordable housing and public infrastructure to pass with 55% of the vote. The question that California voters must decide for themselves is, should they lower the supermajority vote requirement from 66% to only 55% so that local jurisdictions can more easily issue bonds to pay for affordable housing and infrastructure? California finds itself in this situation. California is in the midst of a lengthy affordable housing crisis. However, the state constitution requires all local bond measures, except those that are issued by local school districts and community college districts, all to be approved by a supermajority of 66.6 or 2/3 of all voters. Thus, many local bond measures that would fund low-income housing projects or fire services, these fail by only a few points due to the supermajority rule. Our legislature has proposed the following to fix this problem. If passed, Prop 5 is going to allow local jurisdictions to pass more bonds for affordable housing and public infrastructure and more. Affordable housing includes a bunch of different incomes, up to 150% of the county median income, and also includes lots of groups like veterans and the disabled. And public infrastructure includes lots and lots of our public services like parks, water sanitation, flood control, firehouses, public safety, and much more. This amendment requires the local jurisdiction, that's like your local city or county area, to conduct annual audits. These audits must be posted publicly and accessible to the public and the state auditor for review. Now we will talk about the fiscal impact, or the impact to the pocketbook. The local jurisdiction, that is the city or the county area, will incur indebtedness in the form of a loan that will be repaid with interest over a period not to exceed 40 years. This amendment will increase local borrowing to fund public infrastructure and housing. The amount that will be borrowed is dependent on local government decisions. That means the decisions of the Board of Supervisors in most cases. Borrowing is often repaid with higher property taxes. Here is what supporters say. Lowering the voter threshold, which means taking 66% and turning it down to 55% to pass bond measures, will allow more of them to pass. Allowing only a minority of voters to override the wishes of the majority is not democratic. Supporters say what that means is when bond measures are failing at 61%, the difference between 61% and 66.6% is that small minority. And supporters say if a simple majority of voters want the government to fund desperately needed housing or road repair or firehouses or anything they need to be able to. The opponents are saying about Prop 5 that it's the latest attack on Proposition 13 by Democrats. If an issue like bond funding is so important, it should be made by a large majority of voters. Opponents say the cost of bonds will be paid by property owners, but they make up only a fraction of the majority of voters. Here's your list of supporters and their respective websites: the California Democratic Party, the California State Building and Construction Trades Council, the California Housing Partnership, and California YIMBY. That means yes in my backyard. Here's a list of the opponents of Prop 5: the California Chamber of Commerce, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, and the Catalyst for Local Control. Here is the money raised that will speak for itself. The supporters have raised $1,785,000. The opponents have raised $28,433,000.
Hi, my name's Alex Carlin. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters, and I'm here to talk about Proposition 6 that will be on the ballot in November of 2024. This proposition eliminates a constitutional provision allowing for involuntary servitude by incarcerated persons. This proposed amendment has been proposed by the legislature of the state. Now, this is the real question that California voters will face in November. Should our Constitution be amended to prohibit the disciplining of prisoners, incarcerated persons who refuse work assignments? Now, one interesting thing about this is a lot depends on how you characterize this question. It's a battle of labels. On the one hand, the proponents would say, should we prohibit slavery? Yes or no? The answer to that is pretty obvious. Of course we want to prohibit slavery. The opponents might say, well, no, the way to look at it is, should the prison be able to impose work assignments on able-bodied prisoners? And this will work itself out as we review this proposition further. This slide provides us with some background to Proposition 6. The United States Constitution was amended in 1865 by the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery and involuntary servitude. But it has an exception that says it's okay to require prisoners to work if they've been convicted of a crime. The California Constitution has essentially the same provision in it, and this is the case with most states in the country up until recently. Now, the Supreme Court has upheld this provision and says, yes, it is legitimate and constitutional to allow prisons to require prisoners to work. Likewise, the California courts have upheld the California provision. So California not only is allowed to require prisoners to work, but it does indeed require all able-bodied prisoners to work. There's statutes in California that enact that. California pays the prisoners for their work. Now keep in mind that the provisions of the California law require that the work be safe, the workplaces be safe, and that the work assigned is attempted to be as reasonable to the abilities of the prisoners as possible, and that prisoners are not required to work on the extra hazardous duties such as fire details. Those are purely voluntary, and there's no requirement that they work on firefighting. California also disciplines prisoners who refuse to work. The discipline is, of course, part of the key. How do they discipline them? And in this case, they remove privileges, they'll take away the phone call privileges, and maybe the prisoners don't get credits for good behavior. This slide simply reflects the specific provision of the California Constitution which is involved in this proposition. It's Article 1, Section 6, which is similar to the 13th Amendment, and it prohibits slavery and involuntary servitude, but it does allow the state to require convicted prisoners to work. The proposal would eliminate that exception and not allow the state to require prisoners to work. It's always an important question to ask, what is the fiscal impact or cost of any particular proposal or referendum? And in this case, the fiscal impact of the legislature has reported to us is unknown. They're really not sure. They think it'll be minimal, but the impact is reported as being unknown. This slide will reflect what the advocates or supporters of Proposition 6 say about it and how they are in favor of it. This proposition is worthwhile knowing, results from the California Reparations Task Force report of 2023, which said this should be part of the reparations due to African Americans. So one of the assertions is, and this is by the Legislative Black Caucus of California, that the requirement that prisoners work is a vestige of slavery of African Americans, because they constitute 28% of the California's prison population. Another argument is that requiring prisoners to work will lead to dangerous work conditions which the prison may impose under the guise of requiring reasonable amount of work. They also advocate that forcing people to work can cause them mental health problems, a loss of personal dignity, and depression. They also reflect that Proposition 6 is a part of a national trend. And indeed, there has been a trend over the last few decades to make these kind of changes in state constitutions. There's been no change in the federal constitution, but 4 or 5 states in the last election cycle in 2020 did indeed amend their constitutions to eliminate the exception. They also argue that it's a moral imperative that you shouldn't be requiring and punishing people by forcing them to work. Now, it's important to note that there is no organized opposition to Proposition 6, so this slide just presents what opponents might say to Prop 6. First, I think there's an argument that it is both legally and morally legitimate to require able-bodied individuals to work. They've been convicted of a crime. For the most part, this is a serious crime because they're in state prisons. And so there's an argument that that's legitimate to do that. There's also an argument that work helps rehabilitate prisoners. It's good for them. It will reduce recidivism by teaching them a trade or some sort of activity that is good for the prisoner himself or herself. It's also maybe an argument that it promotes restorative justice, because in the state of California, a portion of the prisoner's pay is sent to the victims of the crime. It also helps defray some of the cost of imprisonment, because a portion, again under California law, a portion of the prisoner's pay, and it isn't very much, but a portion of that pay goes to help defray the cost of imprisoning the individual. Finally, you got to keep in mind that if the working conditions meet safety requirements and discipline that is used is reasonable, California should not be barred from requiring prisoners to work. These are some of the arguments that opponents of Proposition might say. When you get your voting package from the Secretary of State, you'll see there are a lot of supporters to Proposition 6. This is just a few of them. This lists just a few. California Black Chamber of Commerce, several members of the Reparations Committee, the California Public Defenders Association, League of Women Voters are some of the major supporters. As of this time, the Secretary of State of California has identified no organized opposition to Proposition 6. Again, as of this time, the Secretary of State reports that $63,000 has been raised by supporters of Proposition 6 and none has been reported by opponents. So, in balance, there's very little money, one way or the other, that has been devoted to this proposition.
Hello, I'm Mary Beth Starzell, and this is a quick review of Proposition 32 coming to the general election ballot in California November 5th. This is an initiative issue brought forward by citizens signing petitions. This is a really straightforward question. Should the state minimum wage be raised for different groups, depending on their size, to $17 per hour or $18 per hour, with adjustments for cost of living made after 2027? More than 6 million Californians do not have enough money to meet their basic needs. And they're not teenagers in the main, they're adults. 46% of them have children and 40% are married. No one can support a family on the current minimum wage of $16 per hour for people working full-time. They do not have enough money to meet basic needs, and they will need to rely on public resources to make up the difference. If this passes, in 2025, employers with fewer than 25 employees would have a $17 per hour minimum wage. But those with 26 or more employees would have a minimum hourly wage of $18. In 2027, the annual minimum wage would be adjusted to match the cost of living unless there's an economic downturn when there would be no increase. Minimum wage laws do not apply to independent contractors or people who are self-employed. There are many factors that really cannot be accurately predicted for this measure. Some workers, for instance, by making more hourly wages in 2026, could have the effect of pushing up other wages as well. Increased costs for many businesses would have to be passed along, and it would also reduce some businesses' profits. The whole number of jobs in the state could go up or down, but it's hard to know how much. Local government and state government costs, because of paying employees more, could increase, though other factors could decrease other costs. It could also affect income and sales tax revenues. Supporters say that having workers with higher wages will stimulate spending, create more jobs and prosperity for everyone, a rising tide lifting all the boats, so to speak. And higher minimum wages will entice workers back to jobs that have remained with unstable or uncertain wages. In opposition, some think that the markets should be the dictator of wage levels. Others say that higher costs for small businesses would be harder for them and it would actually reduce the number of jobs. Also, it's hard to ask the same wage for corporations and small businesses just as a matter of disproportion. There is a sentiment it will be harder on the poorer areas of the state compared to bigger cities. These are the registered supporters of Proposition 32. And according to the California Secretary of State, these are the registered opponents. The California Secretary of State reports these sums raised from both supporters and opponents for Proposition 32.
Hello, my name is Nancy Clark, and I'll be giving you some information about Proposition 33. The title of the proposition is Expands Local Government's Authority to Enact Rent Control on Residential Property. It is an initiative statute. The question raised by this proposition is, should cities and counties have the right to limit rent on housing and to limit rent for first-time tenants? Often referred to as rent control, this term is defined as the regulation of annual increases in rent in order to prevent unfairly raising rent on tenants, while at the same time allowing for a fair return for landlords. Historically, California has had a wide array of policies governing rent control, with approximately 20 cities out of nearly 500 in the state enforcing some form of control over rents for apartment units, limiting increases to no more than 10% plus inflation. But in 1995, the state limited further rent control through a statewide policy enacted in the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. Costa-Hawkins currently prohibits cities and counties from implementing rental controls on single-family homes, condominiums, and apartment units built after 1995. Put simply, Proposition 33 would repeal the Costa-Hawkins Act. By doing so, cities and counties would have the ability, but not the requirement, to enact local control over rental rates for single-family homes, condominiums, and apartment units built after 1995. It is impossible to accurately estimate the fiscal impact of Proposition 33 on the state, since the state would not be required to provide any cost-bearing services. Any impact would depend upon the actions of local authorities in deciding whether or not to enact control over rents. The fiscal impact on the state would be indirect, primarily through any change in either sales taxes generated by renters or property taxes generated through newly developed properties. Some of the possible scenarios affecting the behavior of tenants include: tenants with lower rents could spend more of their income on purchases, boosting local sales taxes. If rents in non-controlled areas rose, those tenants would have less income available for purchases, lowering local sales taxes. And some renters would move less often, fewer homes would be available to rent. Some of the possible scenarios affecting landlords include: fewer rental houses or units could be built by those seeking higher profits on rents. With fewer properties being developed, property taxes paid to the state would not increase. And it is possible that local governments could incur further costs in implementing rent control. So what do supporters say in favor of Prop 33? Their basic argument is that rental prices in California are too high, with the median rate being the second highest in the country. The rates are now too high for many families and individuals, and therefore high rents are contributing to the problem of homelessness in the state. Supporters also believe that the decision to enact rent control should be made at the local level by voters familiar with their communities and not at the state level where decisions are influenced by political considerations. Opponents also address the issue of homelessness, but they argue that non-availability of housing, not high rental rates, create homelessness. They argue that rent control would make the homelessness problem even worse by lowering the profitability of rental housing and therefore discouraging builders from constructing new rental housing. They argue that only increased housing, not rent control, can solve this problem. In addition, they believe that limiting the ability of landlords to raise rents to market levels for new tenants will make it difficult for them to have the available funds to repair deteriorating housing. and by returning decisions on rent control to cities, they argue that wealthier communities could effectively freeze new housing development in their areas to limit rental units and drive up their own property values. The major supporters for this initiative are justice for renters and housing is a human right. Other supporters include the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, California Alliance for Retired Americans, Tenants Together, Consumer Watchdog, Housing Now, the California Nurses Association, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, and Veterans Voices. The major opponents of Proposition 33 are the California Apartment Association and an organization called California YIMBY, standing for Yes in My Backyard. Other opponents include Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles, the California Business Roundtable, California Small Business Association, California Senior Alliance, California Chamber of Commerce, and the Marine Corps Veterans Association. The amount of money raised keeps changing, but by late August, a total of $57 million had been raised concerning this issue. $17 million to support the measure, the bulk coming from the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and $40 million to oppose the measure, the bulk from the California Association of Realtors and the California Apartment Association. To find the most recent figures, you can go to the website of the California Secretary of State at www.sos.ca.gov and look under Campaign Finance and Lobbying Activities for the most recent figures.
Ed here again with you. I'm going to share with you Proposition 34, the proposition that for certain healthcare providers will restrict the type of spending they do of their prescription drug revenues. Well, here's the question that will be presented to you as a California voter. If there is a healthcare provider that in a given period of 10 years spends over $100 million on items other than direct patient care, should they be required to spend 98% of all the monies they receive from the federal government for their drug program on patient care that is delivered directly? Well, here's the situation. There is a partnership between the federal government and the state government, referred to as Medi-Cal, and they provide health coverage for low-income people. Included with this coverage is the cost of prescription drugs. Now, this program, the Federal Drug Discount Program, provides these drugs at a discount to certain healthcare providers. But in order to qualify for these discounts, providers have to follow certain rules. The reason for this is to allow eligible providers to increase services and in turn be able to serve even more low-income patients. At this point, federal and state law does not restrict these providers on how they spend their money when they get these discounts. So here's the proposal put forth by Proposition 34. If you happen to be a healthcare provider, you may face restrictions if you spend over $100 million in 10 years on anything other than direct patient care. And if you happen to own and operate housing units with over 500 violations on your properties, you would have to spend at least 98% of your revenue on direct care to patients. That would be a requirement. And in order to keep you honest, you would have to submit timely and accurate reports proving how you were spending your money. There's 4 penalties that are involved with Proposition 34. You would lose tax-exempt status. You would lose your license as a healthcare provider. You would lose contracts and grants with the state. And you'd also lose your eligibility to serve in leadership roles when it came to determining state health plans, pharmacies, or clinics. There could be economic consequences to the state if this proposition is passed. Enforcement costs could increase to monitor its restrictions to the tune of millions of dollars every year. The state could possibly recover some of this cost by charging fees to offending healthcare agencies. But there could be some uncertainties. Number 1, for example, if healthcare providers could be motivated to spend more money on direct care, then the state could save more money. 2, if there was a chance of paying fees for violations, then a concern could improve their operations to avoid these penalties. But finally, if the healthcare concerns suffer too many penalties, they may go out of business, and the state and local governments could lose tax revenues. Proponents of Proposition 34 say it's aimed at drug discount program offenders to make sure that their efforts are aimed at providing direct health care to people on low incomes, the very people they had promised to take care of, and sets a limit of 98% of all the money that they earn to be spent on patient care. And while they're at it, would be forcing them to stop overcharging government agencies for prescription drugs. Opponents of Proposition 34, on the other hand, say, wait a minute, this is just a vendetta put forth by one concern, the California Apartment Association, to bully an opponent in the past who has opposed them at the ballot box on other issues. They say that if this bullying is allowed to continue, what's to prevent them from going after other adversaries in the future? And this proposition, they continue, is aimed at the very population that it pretends to protect: low-income seniors, veterans, single parents, and patients with HIV or AIDS. The proponents of Proposition 34 is the heretofore named California Apartment Association. In opposition to Proposition 34 is the nonprofit Housing is a Human Right. And finally, as far as the money raised on this proposition, according to the California Secretary of State's office, supporters have raised almost $24 million, whereas their opponents have gathered together a war chest of over $500,000 to fight this proposition.
Hello, my name is Tony Hyman, and I'm going to share our information on Proposition 35 of the general election ballot. Proposition 35 is aimed at making taxation permanent for health care services provided by Medi-Cal. It is an initiative brought forth by the people. California voters are being asked whether California should make permanent an existing tax on managed health care plans. The purpose is to provide ongoing funds for Medi-Cal and other health care services. At present, a state tax is placed on managed health plans. Now, this tax is set to expire in 2026. The money collected by the state is matched by federal money, and together these are used to pay for health care services for low-income families, for seniors, and for those with disabilities and others who might receive Medi-Cal care. Medi-Cal is the state's version of Medicaid. It provides health coverage to low-income residents who qualify for the program. The tax now in place is only temporary and does require that it be renewed by the state legislature. Passage of Prop 35 would mean that this tax that's now temporary will be made permanent as long as the federal government agrees and pays their share. Furthermore, restrictions would be put on how the tax money will be spent. No longer can it be used for general purposes. Restrictions would require, under the new law, that tax funds only be used for specific care, such as primary care, emergency care, and mental health. This proposition would also keep these monies from replacing any existing Medi-Cal funding. Finally, this measure promises more oversight by placing a cap on expenses and a requirement for independent audit. If Proposition 35 passes, there will be no changes to the current health plan that's already in place. The state will be receiving $2 to $5 billion more per year in funding. This in turn, though, comes with a cost to the state about $1 to $2 billion each year to make these changes. The effect long-term is unknown and depends on the future decisions of our lawmakers in Sacramento, changes to federal funding, and movement in the cost of health care, and how much people use Medi-Cal. Those in favor of this proposition say this measure will give added protection, and it also promises growth to health care for the state's citizens, especially those that are most vulnerable and needy. This proposition, say its supporters, will also provide permanent funding for important health care services without a need to raise further taxes. We would also see improvements in the areas of primary care, specialty care, emergency care, and mental health services. All these improvements would come with increased accountability to make sure that your tax money is being spent as intended. Since there is no organized opposition, there are no arguments published against this proposition. According to the California Secretary of State, the group supporting this is called Yes on 35, Coalition to Protect Access to Care. Long name, but you can learn a lot more about them if you go up to their website, voteyes35.com. That's voteyes35.com. According to the California Secretary of State, there were no arguments submitted against Proposition 35. Everybody always wants to know how much money is being raised. Well, again, because there's no organized opposition to this, there have been no reported funds spent to oppose this measure. On the other hand, $33 million in funds have been raised to help this proposition pass.
Hello, I'm Sharon Ripner, and I'm going to be talking with you today about Proposition 36, which is on the November ballot. Proposition 36 allows felony charges and increases sentences for certain drug and theft crimes. It is an initiative statute. Proposition 36 asks two primary questions. 1. Should certain drug crimes, now charged as misdemeanors, be charged as felonies and result in increased length of sentence to be served in state prison? And question 2. Should theft crimes of $950 or less in money or property, now charged as misdemeanors, be charged as a felony for individuals having 2 or more prior theft-related convictions? And should these felonies result in increased length of prison sentence to be served in state prison? Under Proposition 47, passed in 2014, possession of certain drugs, including fentanyl and thefts under $950, are both crimes currently chargeable only as misdemeanors, and thus any sentence imposed is served only in county jail, not state prison. If passed, Proposition 36 would require several things. First, under the drug portion of the proposition, it would add fentanyl to the list of drugs that warrant a felony charge if an individual possesses one of the drugs and a loaded firearm, and this charge would be punishable by up to 4 years in prison. Further, it would increase the length of prison sentences based on the quantity of drugs sold and require the entire sentence to be served regardless of criminal history. Next, it would establish treatment-mandated felonies for certain drug offenses and would apply to individuals with 2 or more prior convictions for various drug crimes, including possession. If the individual agrees not to contest the charge, he or she could be referred to treatment, and if treatment is successfully completed, the felony would be dismissed. If treatment is not completed, he or she would serve up to 3 years in state prison. And third, Proposition 36 would require courts to warn individuals convicted of distributing deadly illegal drugs of their potential future criminal liability, including being charged with murder if people die as a result of the drugs they sold. Also, under the theft portion of the Proposition 36, it would increase penalties for certain theft crimes. Currently, theft of money or property worth $950 or less is charged as a misdemeanor and punishable by up to 6 months in jail. Under Proposition 36, this would be a crime chargeable as a felony for individuals with 2 or more prior theft-related convictions, and would be punishable by up to 3 years in jail or prison, depending upon criminal history. Proposition 36 would also increase sentences based on the amount of property stolen. Proposition 36 would result in an increased state criminal justice system costs, potentially in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually, due to increasing our state prison population. It would also result in increased local criminal justice system costs, potentially in the tens of millions of dollars annually, due to increased court-related workload and a net increase in the number of people in county jail and under county community supervision. It should be noted that potentially some of these costs could be offset by reductions in current Proposition 47 state spending on local mental health and substance use services, truancy, dropout prevention, and victim services. Supporters hold that Proposition 36 makes targeted but impactful changes to previously passed Proposition 47. It effectively holds individuals accountable for repeat crimes of theft and crimes involving serious drugs like fentanyl, while making sure individuals receive and complete drug and mental health treatment they need. Opponents to Proposition 36 hold that it would reverse the state's gains in reducing the dangerous, racially unequal, and unconstitutionally crowded prison population. Further, they find that it would make California less safe, as programs funded by Proposition 47, which have reduced recidivism without increasing violent crime, would have their funding reduced for services including employment assistance for those coming out of jail, victim services, and housing. And last, drug and mental health treatment, which could be ordered under Proposition 36, is not equally available across the state's counties. Thus, imprisonment rather than treatment options would be unfairly based upon where people live rather than their willingness to participate in such treatment. Here is the list of the supporters for Proposition 36. Please note that among the major supporters of this bill are major retailers and law enforcement unions, including the California Correctional Police Officers Association. And here is a list of the opponents for Proposition 36. Please note that opposition to this proposition comes primarily from criminal and racial justice groups, as well as from Governor Newsom and the state Democratic Party. The funding amounts you see here have been provided by the Secretary of State for the state of California and are current as of the end of August 2024. The stark difference that you see in the funding levels for support versus opposition suggests the importance of passing this measure to the bottom line of those supporting it, that is, big business and law enforcement unions, especially the California Correctional Police Officers Association.
Thank you for your perseverance. We hope that we have been of help with your study of the propositions. We finally encourage you to visit our local league website. The website has multiple ways to help you be an informed voter. It features a link to 411, our tool for you to get personalized information on candidates and measures affecting you. It will also supply you with links to the California Secretary of State, as well as the county clerk's office, and even quiz you on your general knowledge of elections. Access our league's website at LWVSLOCO.clubexpress.com. Again, on behalf of the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County, we thank you for being an engaged and informed voter. Adios.